Hello again, and welcome back to HAWK MOOR, where we explore the history, present, and future of Greyhawk, Blackmoor, and Dungeons & Dragons. We continue our questing together. And now, fellow adventurers, as we stand outside the Tomb of the Undead, here is a recent and developing history question that people are asking today. How did Dungeons & Dragons end up in the hands of a company that doesn't care about it in the slightest, a company that doesn't even understand what a role-playing game is? The answer is that there is a terrible curse. Dungeons & Dragons, however much we might love it, is a cursed intellectual property. It is the curse of the dragon's greed. The game's ownership has always been contentious from the very beginning. It all started around 1969 into 1970 when two men, Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, realized that they had very cool and unusual similar interests. They became friends and started communicating long distance and sharing ideas. Gary was already an accomplished wargamer and wargame designer, but he still had a lot to learn. One of Gary's strengths was his receptivity toward other people's unusual ideas that had great hidden potential. Arneson was an innovator. He could spot existing systems and figure out ways to make them more ambitious, more wide-reaching than their original design might imply. Over time, Gary learned many of the concepts of free-form game refereeing, a skill set that we now call dungeon mastering, from Dave Arneson. In return, Gary taught Dave about process refinement, iteration, and foundational systems that encouraged even further innovations. In 1970 and 1971, Gary and his friend Jeff Perrin designed a medieval wargame called Chainmail, which had Gary's strange fantasy supplement attached to the end of it. Dave Arneson borrowed concepts from Fantasy Chainmail to improve his own pre-existing adventure campaigns, and he improved upon them further through playtesting and intuitive improvisation with his own playgroup. Dave and Gary shared their ideas and system refinements through postcards, phone calls, and the occasional face-to-face gaming session. Throughout 1972 and 1973, Dave and Gary collaborated on an entirely new game that would focus on the fantasy adventure elements of this emerging playstyle called Dungeons & Dragons. But because of philosophical, personal, and game design differences, the genesis of Dungeons & Dragons was more driven by Gary than by Dave. And Dave was a younger single man living in Minnesota. Gary was an older family man living in Wisconsin. They came from different walks of life, and they each ran in very different playgroups on a daily basis. They really didn't see each other often. Without Dave being involved, Gary and his other friend, Don Kay, started a tiny game company in Wisconsin called Tactical Studies Rules, or TSR, which got off the ground in 1973 to launch Dungeons & Dragons in early 1974. Dave, for his part, got a small royalty from every copy of Dungeons & Dragons sold. In 1975 and 1976, Dave became more closely associated with TSR's growing and more commercial concepts of game design. But Dave was only a subsidiary employee to TSR, under the supervision of both Gary and Brian Bloom. The fact that Gary and Dave were now not on equal footing, despite being the co-authors of Dungeons & Dragons, caused very serious problems. There was a permanent falling out between them in 1976, when Dave and Gary could not agree on how any new game should be designed, or how collaborative TSR game design concepts should even take place. Dave wanted to involve the Twin Cities group in TSR, And Gary, his boss, strictly wanted to keep things under his own watch in Lake Geneva. Keep in mind I am greatly simplifying this history here for the purposes of background. So in the end, Dave left TSR. From 1977 and into the 1980s, Dave kept pushing TSR and Gary to provide fairer royalties for Dungeons & Dragons and its associated and ever-growing library of supplements. Gary, for his part, stubbornly designed advanced Dungeons & Dragons instead, and declared it to be a separate game, denying Dave Arneson of those royalties entirely. Dave argued that advanced Dungeons & Dragons and other supplements were derivative works, powered by the original game engine and concepts that he helped to create. Dave won these lawsuits and settlements over time, by the way. Gary, though, felt that he himself deserved much more than half of the credit because he took the financial risks and performed the labor to get Dungeons & Dragons off the ground. But those facts were not enough to keep shutting Dave out of the royalties for the ever-evolving game. And Gary did not do himself any favors by leaving Arneson's name off of the game's advanced hardcovers, such as the Monster Manual. The fact remained that without Dave Arneson's innovations, Dungeons & Dragons would have never existed. But Dungeons & Dragons would have never gotten popular at all without Gary's publicity, refinement, and financial risk-taking. Moving on, Dungeons & Dragons made many millions of dollars. Obviously, with the way that advanced Dungeons & Dragons was set up, Gary made more of those millions than Dave did. But TSR became too big for any one person to control. In 1985, Gary lost control of TSR to his business partners. It was a very cutthroat situation, and that tale does not have any heroes. From that point forward, the design and publication of Dungeons & Dragons was completely out of Gary's hands, and Dave was shut out entirely because he didn't want to deal with it all. He just wanted his royalties from D&D to fund his own personal projects. TSR, the company, moved on without both men. The company's publications did okay, but not great, from 1986 into the summer of 1993. But then another new threat arose that almost killed TSR. This was a new game called Magic the Gathering, released by an upstart company called Wizards of the Coast in the summer of 1993. Magic the Gathering grabbed all of the fantasy tropes of Dungeons & Dragons, simplified them, made them pretty, made them competitive, and presented them in a revolutionary new collectible card game format. This format addicted its players and demanded huge sums of money from its consumers. The more money you had, the more games of Magic you won. I know this because I played both Dungeons & Dragons and Magic in August of 1993, the time period of Alpha. I was friends with a shopkeeper who bought a bunch of Alpha Magic at Gen Con and brought it all home to Colorado Springs for us to try out and play test. But that's a story for another day. The industry and the fantasy fans kept changing. The 90s were rough for gaming companies, but lucrative as well. TSR, without Gary or Dave, rode high for a while, but even without considering the threat brought on by Magic the Gathering, the company was mismanaged and began to falter all on its own. There was corruption, nepotism, favoritism, factionalism, and a good grand helping of general stupidity. So TSR crashed into the ground in 1997. Wizards of the Coast bought out TSR in that same year. In doing so, they gained possession of the past, present, and future of Dungeons & Dragons. In 1998, in a crucial point that is often overlooked today, Wizards of the Coast secured the license to publish the Pokemon card game due to their market dominance in collectible cards, caused by their runaway success with Magic the Gathering. While the Wizards were making record sums of money off of Magic and Pokemon, they attracted the attention of a game and toy giant known as Hasbro. Hasbro was a big, fierce rival who wanted Pokemon all for themselves. They also wanted lots of money, and as we all know, it takes money to make money. So, Wizards of the Coast days as a freewheeling company were numbered. Dungeons & Dragons, though, was just a footnote property at the time. D&D was basically a flea on the back of the Golden Goose. The Golden Goose, of course, was the collectible card game genre. Hasbro had absolutely no interest in Dungeons & Dragons at all. And I would argue that lack of interest in the game by Hasbro continued for decades into the present day. And that's where all of the big problems in culture come from. Now, personally, keep in mind that I do not like Wizards of the Coast. Ever since the OGL debacle, long story, I feel like that company has treated the old school fandom extremely badly. The way that I see it, the Wizards stand on the shoulders of giants, while pretending to themselves that they made everything all by themselves. And then they cry that those old giants are bad people. These days, the Wizards of the Coast are more of a social disinformation network than a gaming company. They succeed despite themselves, only because of some gifted employees. And they don't treat their employees well at all. Their idea of a Christmas present is a layoff. Your personal informed opinion might vary from mine, and that's fine. Nevertheless, I will say one good thing about the Wizards of the Coast. The old magic made by Peter Adkison is not entirely gone yet. The people who are still there do understand at least some of what makes Dungeons & Dragons tick. Hasbro, on the other hand, is a gigantic empire with way too many properties. Hasbro has absolutely no idea what Dungeons & Dragons actually is, or the spirit of the game. There are good people working at Hasbro. I know this for a personal fact, but the leadership there is something else. To the leadership, not understanding the origin or the spirit of Dungeons & Dragons is fine, because they don't care about the origins or the spirit. They just care about making money. So Hasbro, wanting Pokemon and Magic, bought out Wizards of the Coast in 1999. In their minds, they were just buying the collectible card games. They understood trading cards and how to market them. Trading cards are easy. You spend a few $1 million and you make lots of millions of dollars. You just need to keep the quality up, keep it pretty, keep the rarities of the power cards rigged and unfair, and keep your consumers addicted to the gambling aspect of opening new card packs, while also pretending in the legal venues, such as the courts, that card games aren't gambling at all. So, Hasbro, taking in the Wizards, was basically in the same role as a vampire lord. They really didn't care what D&D was, or what its spirit was, and they still don't, and perhaps they never will. They're too big to care about any of their actual intellectual properties as wonderful ideas in and of themselves. And they absolutely don't care about Gary or Dave or any of the old school fans at all. They just want to keep sucking the property dry. Why? Because money. And the Wizards' little treasures forced to go along in this sale, like Dungeons & Dragons and other minor properties, were just the red-headed stepchildren who were dragged along with the vampire lords' two hot new vampire brides, Countess Magic and Countess Pokemon. As long as both brides were tempted in and seduced and kept in line and controlled, nothing else really mattered. The Wizards kept making Dungeons & Dragons products. They eventually lost the Pokemon license, But that was not surprising, and Magic kept running and getting bigger, so that was okay. And Hasbro, the makers of Transformers, G.I. Joe, Nerf, Monopoly, Power Rangers, My Little Pony, and other gigantic franchises, basically forgot all about their own ownership of Dungeons and Dragons until the franchise accidentally took off again in the 2010s. The interesting thing is, Dungeons & Dragons didn't even take off because the Wizards of the Coast were fantastic at making D&D products. Instead, the resurgence of D&D popularity was an accident. The Wizards' idea of a strategic marketing campaign involves embracing politics, laying off their employees, treating people badly, a scandal here and there, and also pissing off as many devoted old schoolers as possible. Dungeons & Dragons' popularity took off again, despite the Wizards, because of highly influential and high-quality outside entities, like Critical Role and Stranger Things, and these entities skillfully glamorized the mystique of D&D, despite the Wizards' inept mishandling of the entire franchise. Critical Role and Stranger Things and others you see celebrate the spirit of the game because they understand it, and they understand it because they love it. But to this day, no one in the Hasbro leadership seems to understand or love Dungeons & Dragons at all. They seem to resent D&D because they can't break its spirit entirely. There's too many people alive who still love the original old school game. Take me, for example. I've loved and played and dungeon mastered and researched and studied and written for the game for 45 years. And there are other people out there I know personally who have way more experience and knowledge than I do. So Hasbro doesn't like Dungeons & Dragons. Why? Because they can't force it to be something that it never was and never will be. To Hasbro, D&D is just that weird little board game without a board. The weird little video game series that doesn't always get played on a computer somehow. So it's obviously broken from that line of thinking because it doesn't fit into any of the round peg holes that Hasbro has built for all of its other intellectual properties to fit into. Remember, Hasbro is strictly a for-profit corporation. Beloved toys and games, to them, are just intellectual properties. The properties that make money get attention, and the ones that lose money or don't make enough money get shelved, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades. So there are a few beloved children there, so long as they keep overachieving and making their parents look good. And then there are all of the measly, filthy, underperforming little rugrats who they toss under the stairs. However, the accountants and shareholders insist that they do check on all of their children for a welfare check from time to time. When any intellectual property is not making enough money and the bean counters suspect that a property's blood could be sucked dry with only a little more creative squeezing, that IP is called under-monetized. In the case of Dungeons & Dragons, that weird red-headed stepchild, it is not regarded as a board game or a card game. This confuses Hasbro. It makes them mad. So they literally decide that the reason why Dungeons & Dragons doesn't make enough money is not because it has decades of unique history, with its gifted designers encouraging a million new dungeon masters to craft their own tools with ingenuity and care. No, Hasbro leadership decided that D&D was under-monetized because it was not yet fully a video game. So they just needed to keep smashing the square corners off of that stubborn old brick until it finally fits into a round hole, a hole that they can understand. I wish I was joking or exaggerating. Anyway, to further monetize the D&D IP, Hasbro and the Wizards of the Coast decided that they needed to market directly to the players. By players, we mean non-dungeon masters, the people who act out the roles of player characters in the game. In the past, dungeon masters bought most of the products. The players rarely bought products beside a few minor purchases, unless their dungeon master wanted to put something in the game that the players were also interested in. To Hasbro, D&D's non-dungeon master players are unrealized and underperforming customers. To Hasbro's way of thinking, they just need to make products that appeal to non-DM player wallets, which means that the role of the dungeon master in the game needs to be greatly minimized in order to allow for total majority player control of the game, which in turn means that all dungeon masters need to be disempowered and put down in their place. So new editions of Dungeons & Dragons were written to take the creative storytelling and the love of the game and the adjudication powers entirely out of the dungeon master's hands, and then to put all of that power into the player's hands instead. The modern dungeon master is now relegated to the Igor Hunchback role in the haunted Hasbro castle. He gets to be the slave, the errand runner, and the wish fulfiller for all the lucky players. And they better say, "Yes, master," and do as he's told, or else. A few of these hunchbacked Igor slaves have actually escaped from the castle, and now, apparently, they force players to purchase their services as DMs. The concept of the DM and the players being unpaid friends who all love the game equally and learn the DM's crafted secrets over time, that's largely forgotten. But for Hasbro, the bigger problem is, it turns out that over 90% of players don't ever spend thousands of dollars on Dungeons & Dragons like the Dungeon Masters do. You can convert all of the players into buyers and wallets that you want. But if you piss off the old dungeon masters and the old schoolers who have invested decades of their lives, the franchise begins to collapse. That's because the spirit of the game is based on the role of the dungeon master as storyteller and leader of the group, just like it always was from 1973 onward. A lack of dungeon masters, in turn, leads to a lack of directed play groups, and this causes players to lose interest in the hobby, which then decreases the overall monetization or blood-sucking of the D&D IP. When you turn the players against the dungeon masters, you create a game that cannot run itself. Because again, Dungeons & Dragons is not a board game, or a card game, or a video game. D&D is a role-playing game of limited information. It works because the dungeon master provides the limited information, and the players with their skills expand upon that core and make it wider with the choices that they make. And this is why Hasbro wants to turn D&D into a video game. They want to create a venue, a profitable venue, where the game can still be played even if all of the veteran dungeon masters quit. And they want to change the game into a World of Warcraft style subscription service with purchasable upgrades and extra transactional luxuries every month, so that they can increase the amount of cash that is spent by each and every player. And so, the spirit of Dungeons & Dragons has been almost completely cannibalized in order to maximize quarterly profits. But now, the fight to twist Dungeons & Dragons into something that it is not has gone on for too long. The sun is rising, and the vampire hunters are angry and out in force. As I am writing this in April 2025, it looks like Hasbro might be royally challenged, at least for the near future. Many players don't like the new edition 5.5, which appears to be, if I am understanding the offered themes correctly, a softcore prom, circus, and barista lifestyle simulator. Many dungeon masters don't seem to like it either. The virtual tabletop digitization initiative has failed disastrously, and that development team has been laid off. The masterpiece Baldur's Gate 3 was not a Dungeons & Dragons game, let's face it. That was a Larian Studios game, and that team apparently does not want to work with Hasbro anymore ever again. The veteran game designers at Wizards of the Coast have already been pushed out, or they're retiring or leaving. And the actual spirit of Dungeons & Dragons now appears, to my mind, to be enthroned in places like Castle Zagig and Shadowdark. And now, in the wider realms beyond Greyhawk and Blackmoor, massive stupid tariffs have been applied to virtually all real physical goods that are being traded internationally, which means that Hasbro is going to lose most of its ability to manufacture non-digital toys and games. What happens next? I honestly don't know. But when I say that Dungeons & Dragons was better in the early days, and that I favor the simpler times when the spirit of the game mattered more, when friends mattered more, hopefully you can see at least a little of where I'm coming from. We all play different editions, but we all play because we love the game. Players loving the game? Yes. Dungeon masters loving the old school game? Also yes. Corporations loving the game? Not so much. Like I said, this game has always been cursed with the curse of the dragon's greed. People have been fighting for ownership and control of this game since the very beginning. So that will always be going on in the background. It doesn't really matter which flavor of Dungeons & Dragons you prefer. You can keep playing it. You can have fun. You can keep enjoying it. You can have your own opinions, your own convictions that will be different from my own. Keep enjoying the game and keep creating. Keep learning about the roots of the game and what that represents. Keep changing the game to suit your own imagination. But you just might need to get used to the old school idea that you can't always find the game add-ons that you need in an affordable store or a corporate catalog or online. Those tariffs are expensive to we the people. You might need to create those add-ons yourself, with your friends the players, with history and research, with folklore, with mythology, with storytelling, and with the power of your own imagination. In that way, at least, we seem to be entering a new Dungeons & Dragons golden age. If the money crumbles, the game does not die. It just gets returned to the players and the dungeon masters. It gets returned to the place where it was in the very beginning. Meanwhile, the fact that while we play and love our game, that some corporations might collapse into smoldering wreckage, well, that's horrible, or that's just the cherry on top of our extra delicious cake. Whatever you believe, enjoy the game with your family and friends. Play it your way. Keep the old school, keep moving the new school on into the next generation, just like I play Castle Old Skull, Blackmoor, and Greyhawk with my son. Take care. I'll see you.